welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today we are going to talk about some recent litigations against death doulas. There have been a couple big stories in the news, at least in the end-of-life community, against some death doulas, and I wanted to kind of bring this to the forefront to educate that this has happened and how it went and what it means for the future of death doula work in the United States. So we'll get to that in just a moment, but first, as always, I would love it if you would support me on Patreon. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. For as little as $1 a month, you can help me to provide pro bono services to those who cannot afford my services. I said services twice. That's okay. You get what I mean. I am trying to do much more community outreach. I'm trying to educate the community around me, and I am trying to help provide services to a couple of different folks out there who are on their own and older and don't have money to spend. And I'm helping them anyway. I'm helping them right now, the goodness of my heart. But I would love it if I could also pay my bills. That would be nice. So this is where you could come in. You can help support me to continue providing these services without panicking and not having to look for another part-time job. I have several. So that is at patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. You can get access to my podcast a week early, weekly grief affirmations, and other bonus content I think of on the fly sometimes. So come on over to patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. There's also now a chat feature on Patreon, so you can chat with other people who follow me and get to know each other and talk all about grief and death and maybe have a little support there. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's start talking about some of these litigations that have come against some end-of-life doulas and what happened and what they mean. So like I said, these aren't exactly new. These are things that happened a few years back, but these are things that have been kind of coming to our attention recently, and as it's happening a little more, unfortunately, frequently. I attended a webinar a couple weeks ago, as of the time of recording this, on the litigations and what they mean for us. So I thought I'd share a little bit of that with you. It was a joined webinar between INELDA, which is where I received my training, the International End-of-Life Doula Association, and NEDA, the National End-of-Life Doula Association, who brought in a couple of attorneys from the Institute for Justice, who were the attorneys that represented the end-of-life doulas in these cases. So I'm going to talk first about Full Circle. It's a nonprofit in California. The full name is Full Circle of Living and Dying. And it was, like I said, it's a center in California that provides end-of-life planning and services and doula services. So basically what happened with Full Circle is this started back in 2019. And again, this is a end-of-life doula service in Sacramento, California. The two owners, Akila Murphy and Donna Pizer, I'm not sure if it's Pizer or Pizer, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, I'm so sorry. They were informed by the California Cemetery and Funeral Bureau that their nonprofit organization was breaking the law. They were acting and advertising as a funeral establishment without a funeral director's license. Okay, so that was the crux of the litigation that was brought against them. So the state of California came in and said they had to shut down their business. They had to gain funeral directors' licenses and have a brick and mortar location where they can store, embalm, and cremate remains. That is, and every state's a little bit different. I'll get into the other one here in a little bit, but within California law, in order to be a licensed funeral director, you have to have a brick and mortar location, and you have to have the ability to store, embalm, and cremate bodies. So that is a requirement in that state to be a licensed funeral director. So they did not have those things. They did have a brick and mortar location, but they did not have the ability to store or embalm or cremate remains. But that's because that's not a service they were providing, obviously, which is why they didn't have that. So, and anecdotally, the lawyers that presented were talking about this case because they had represented them. At first, they got, this letter in the mail from these funeral directors in California, and they thought it was like, okay, whatever. They kind of brushed it off until some actual litigation from the state of California came out and was like, nope, you're shutting down. This is it. You're done. Which is when they reached out to an attorney for help. So this was a bit of a process. They finally teamed up the Institute for Justice in 2020. And I believe the ruling didn't come until 2023, if I remember correctly. So this was an ongoing kind of battle back and forth. And the doulas they're in, their organization, even some of their consumers brought forth a suit arguing that all these licensing restrictions are violating their rights to free speech and the ability for them to earn a living. And I'll just spoil it. The doulas won. The court sided with them because they realized after all this tiresome investigation that they weren't practicing funerals. They weren't holding funerals there. They weren't even acting in the capacity of funeral directors. All they were doing was educating their clients on their innate rights of what they could and could not do within their homes, as far as if they wanted to have a home funeral. That is something that they're allowed to do. And they would never run the funerals. They would never try to prepare the bodies. That was left up to the families, because families are allowed to care for their own deceased within their home. They're allowed to bathe them, store them, and prepare them, and they can even transport them to burial themselves. You don't need to hire a funeral director for these. So obviously, the funeral industry hates this because that's taking money out of their pockets, and that's understandable on their behalf, right? It's kind of taking business for them. But let's face it, the funeral industry is not exactly hurting for money or business. That's not an issue. They're making an issue out of something that doesn't exist. So, and that's just me on my soapbox. This is me speaking, me. This has nothing to do with anything anybody said. I'm just speaking what I'm saying. I'm just speaking what I'm saying. You know what I mean. I'm just calling it like I see it, shall we say. So anyway, the court did agree with the doulas on the side, and they said that there was no issue. They weren't stealing business, and that by having these litigations brought against them was an infringement on their First Amendment rights to speak freely about rights of the people, to speak freely about here are your options. And that's it. They're educating. They're not holding the actual funerals. They're not performing the ceremonies. They're not performing anything like embalming or cremation or anything at their facility, because that's not what they want to do. They're just educating people on their rights to do that on their own. So, yay. I mean, that's great that they, quote unquote, won that litigation instance. I'm trying really hard to be impartial here. So, again, I can see where the funeral industry might get anxious about things like this, because that's money out of their pockets. But in the end, most people end up hiring funeral directors anyway, even if they're not doing the casket or the embalming or the big ceremony. A lot of times it's easier to hire a funeral director to help take care of the paperwork and get the transport, things like that. So in my opinion, just like I'm seeing it, I don't think we're taking a lot of business away from them. Okay. And again, I don't think the funeral industry is exactly hurting for money right now. So the other litigation that happened was much closer to home for me. I had heard about this, and this was just in the past year. There was a young lady who does basically exactly what I do out in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Her name is Lauren Richwine. She's the owner of Death Done Differently, and she's a death doula in Fort Wayne. And most of what she does is public education, much like what I do. I do a lot of speaking about end-of-life work, and this is exactly what she was doing. And she would educate people with terminal diagnosis of their options and their end-of-life plans. And she had tons of individualized services and help people do what I do, write letters for their family members, put together their paperwork, or just discuss death. That's it. And she would occasionally give lectures in groups, like hospices, churches, like I'm doing as well. Now, again, anecdotally, from what the attorneys were saying, like she would go to these and talk to people about their different options. And she even had a big binder she took with her with flyers and pamphlets for local funeral homes. Like, here's this great funeral home. Here's another great funeral home. There's all these different funeral homes here. She even went to these places to get their price lists, because I've talked about that, about the FTC regulations on what the funeral industry has to provide as far as price listing. So she would physically go into these places and get price lists and give them to people. Like, if you go to this funeral home, here's what it's going to cost. If you go here, here's what it's going to cost. So she was almost advertising for some of these funeral homes in her local area, but they came after her for the same thing, saying she was practicing funeral rites without a director's license, which, in the way I'm describing it, that makes you go, no duh. It's very much skewed, because she was informing people that they could do home funerals if they wanted. She was not holding them. She was not performing them. Again, the funeral industry came in and says, nope, you can't do any of that. You have to shut down your business and you have to get a license and open up a brick and mortar place with an embalming table and all the chemicals and whoop-de-doo. And that was the state of Indiana that came after her. Once again, thankfully, the law sided on her side. They, again, said it was First Amendment rights being violated. All she's doing is educating people. She wasn't performing any of these ceremonies. She wasn't taking care of any of these bodies physically. She was just educating the public on their rights, and that's it. So those are two yay cases, and I am quite sure there are many other out there that are just beginning. So what does that mean for death doulas now and in the future? Well, first of all, we have to really work a little bit harder to cover our butts, right? We have to do a little CYA here. We have to be very cautious about what we are advising people and what we are doing with our families when it comes to things like funeral planning. So we obviously cannot hold funerals. We cannot care for bodies ourselves. Like, somebody can't pay me to come in and wash, prepare, keep dry ice on their deceased loved one in their home. If they do that, that might be viewed as me practicing funeral rites and doing what a funeral director should do without a license. So yeah, we just have to tread very lightly on what we do. And I personally don't even advertise or mention any type of home funeral services because, quite honestly, I am not ready for that. I'm not set up for that. I don't know enough either. I'd like to be trained in things like this. And honestly, I'm a little scared to even offer this as an option. I can look up our state laws and share them with my clients. I can look up what is legal and what is not legal and share that with my clients. And that is where my services will have to end as far as afterlife care. I will say all of the clients I have worked with and am currently working with have plans that involve funeral homes. So I don't have to worry about that at this moment, but it is something I have to worry about going forward. I have to be careful about what I even say on my website. I have to be careful about what I say on social media. I'm honestly a little nervous about this podcast. I'm not going to lie. I'm putting this out there. That might open me up to have somebody come and look at me because all these lawsuits are complaint driven. There's no state authority going around scoping out death doulas. It's people in the funeral industry finding them and bringing this to the attention of the states they're in. So, yeah, I'm not going to lie, this does make me a bit nervous. But I am going to do everything I can to keep going forward and just be as cautious as possible. Home funerals are not something I offer. I would love to someday, but I don't know if or when or how that will be a possibility. I love the idea of home funerals. I would love for an industry and a licensed funeral... oh my God, you guys, I cannot say funeral director. It's that rural juror thing. Maybe my Midwestern accent. But I would love to see an actual licensed funeral director offering home funeral services. How great would that be? I'd love to see that happen here in Columbus, Ohio. Make it so, people. Make it so. Okay. So that's really all I had for this episode. I just wanted to share these two rather interesting lawsuits that happened and what that could mean. So nothing's written out, nothing's in stone, but all of us are being cautioned to just be careful about what services we're offering and how, and to make sure we're checking in with our individual states and what our legalities are. So believe you me, I have looked into all the laws in Ohio, so I know what I can and cannot do. And I just have to kind of cover my butt on this for now. So I have not made a secret about how I feel about a lot of the funeral industry in the United States. And I would love to see changes happen, but I also respect that it is an industry that is needed and used, and some people really appreciate the services they offer. I mean, there are services the funeral industry offers that I appreciate too. They do a lot of the nitty-gritty work, so we don't have to, and so families don't have to. It's not a giant evil thing. The funeral industry can and should continue to exist, but I would love to see some modifications on how they can interact with the public and how other people can just practice their innate rights with their family members. You don't have to continue to do things the same way because it's the way we've always done it. Because let's face it, the funeral industry as we know it now has only existed for a couple hundred years. A lot of this was started during the Civil War when folks wanted to see their loved ones that went off to war after they had died to have that closure. And that's so important. I would never poop on that. If people need to have that closure, of course they should. But that doesn't mean we can't have other options out there. So that's my little soapbox. I'll pop down off it now. That's really about all I had for this episode. So without further ado, now that we're at the end of the episode, it is time for the Death Deck. Woo. Okay, so I'm going to shuffle up the cards here. There's so many. Pull one from random, and this one, this makes perfect sense for me. Talking about death and my own mortality, A, reminds me to appreciate the life and time that I have. B, isn't my first choice, but I do contemplate it at times. Or C, is literally the last subject I'd care to discuss. May I leave now? So this one, I think you all know how I feel about it, given that I have an entire podcast dedicated to grief and death and dying. I absolutely have no issue talking about it. And honestly, like, my direct answer wouldn't exactly be on this card. I do agree with A. It reminds me to appreciate the time that I have. And I do. And talking about this does remind me, yes, I am mortal. I will die at some point. And I need to appreciate what I can now. But also, talking about dying and my own mortality helps destigmatize it, just like this podcast does with me talking about grief. The more we talk about these things, the less stigmatized they are, the less scary they are. And I appreciate thinking and talking about death and my own mortality just to help other people. That's why I do 90% of what I do. I just like helping other people. I'm one of those sick weirdos that way. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. You can find me on all the socials. I'm on, well, not all of them. You can find me on 3 of the socials. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. My user handle on all of those is Nikki the Death Doula. You can find me right here on this podcast, which you already did. Good job. What you could really do to help me out is tell a friend about my podcast, a friend that might appreciate it. If there's somebody out there that's like, ooh, death and ooh, grief, I mean, maybe share it with them. That they might get something out of this. But if you know somebody that might really appreciate what I have to say here, share this podcast with them. Tell them all about it. Better yet, leave a review or a rating. Just click the little 5-star thingy on whatever tool you're using to listen to this podcast on. Leave me a rating and a review. It's how more people can find me. And I would love to help more people get my word out there. So you can also find me on Patreon. Brought that up at the beginning. Patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. Help me to provide pro bono services out there. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you have an amazing week. And remember, as always, your grief is yours. Your feelings are valid. Grief doesn't always have to suck.